Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a submarine special. And our guest is Roger Moorhouse, who is returning to the channel to talk about his latest book, Wolfpack, the chance the history of the German U-boat fleet through the eyes of the men who crewed them. Links to buy the book, of course, can be found below, or you can find it wherever you get your books. I'll bring Roger in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm very good, Woody. How are you?
I'm good. So we were just talking before going live there about the different aspects of history in World War II you've written about, and U-boats. They feel like they have been written about a lot, and yet at the same time, they haven't. And I was just going to begin by saying about my visit to La Rochelle a few years ago in France. And all the books in the bookstore were about U-boats. There was nothing about the wider Battle of the Atlantic. It all seemed to be celebrating mission after mission, pictures of U-boat commanders with garlands around their necks and lots of smiling, and didn't seem to talk much about kind of the decline and the end and the losses. Is that your perception? Was that your perception going into this project, that we kind of think about the glory years of the U-boats and not the hard reality?
I think broadly that's probably true. I think certainly the English speaking narrative on this one, which is, with all due respect to the French, but I think is the sort of broadly dominant one, is I think it overestimates the degree of threat, because that's it's kind of it's time specific where the threat is really that great. Overestimates that, and then you've got, it depends what sort of history you're talking about, and there's the sort of slightly nerdy, the sort of almost regimental history kind of level history, which sort of tends to look at individual boats or individual flotillas, individual commanders, and it looks at them almost in isolation from everything else that's going on. So you lack a little bit of the overview. But for me, I think the key thing was, where I saw a gap was that, looking at the Battle of the Atlantic in general, wider U-boat war, the German experience, the German voice in all of that was kind of missing. And, it was all told from the perspective of the destroyers and the merchantmen. And I get that. I get why that would be the case. Certainly for the opening couple of decades after the war, this is our story, British and Americans. We need to explain how we, defeated that peril in World War II. The voices that we have are those that, survived the experience. So I can understand why that was the bias at the beginning. 80 years on, it feels a bit peculiar that, in a sense, the German voices have been, fairly consistently written out of the grand narrative, apart from this, as I said, the slightly sort of nerdy stuff that celebrates individual commanders. So that was my intention with this, was to try and essentially tell the story of the wider U-boat war, but from a German perspective, and see where that got me, because very often a shift of perspective forces you to ask different questions, and you get different answers, and before you know it, you've got a different narrative.
When we've talked with people like Prit Buttar and Philip Blood about, for example, the Wehrmacht generals and the sort of self-aggrandizing after the war some of them did, obviously with the losses of the U-boat crews, the number that just didn't make it out of the war. When you looked at the kind of the source material at the beginning of this, did you find it kind of very, very realistic and true, or did you feel there was a little bit of sort of trying to move away from things or ignore certain aspects? How did you approach it, and what sort of criteria did you use for examining the sources?
As usual, I mean, you always have to sort of deploy a certain degree of, discretion when you're looking at these sources, especially first-hand sources where you very often can't get, independent sort of verification or corroboration of a source. Then you have to just sort of have a sniff at it, if you like. And I've done that before. I've done that. Did a book called Berlin at War many years ago, 15 years ago now, where I did a lot of interviews with, those that had survived the war in Berlin. And some of the stories that I was told there, again, they literally cannot be verified. But I had to apply sort of a sniff test, and so is this plausible or not? And I suppose that's your sort of historian's training and so on. So there's a little bit of that as well. I was quite wary of those that there's some that sort of do try and puff themselves up a little bit, and particularly things like there's a couple of accounts talking about the Type 21s. They never really saw combat, but there's this persistent story of a Type 21 at the end of the war which supposedly locked on to, I think it was HMS Suffolk, and then decided not to press the button, basically. And it was it's often retold, as an example of, this is what the Type 21 could have achieved. It could do that. It could have had this sort of, big spectacular right at the end of the war, and they chose not to. That's been pretty roundly disproven. That was a myth. So you just have to have your wits about you with all this sort of thing, because there is a degree of mythology around all of it, and that's what we're always trying to be aware of and try and combat as best we can.
Thank you. And the next thing I want to bring in is the timeline. When we're talking about something like the ground campaign in the Mediterranean, we have these absolutely central events that are part of how we deal with the time effect. So Operation Torch or Salerno or Anzio. The U-boat war is a little bit difficult because the Battle of Atlantic is the longest battle of World War II, arguably. And yet it does have these sort of labels of first happy time, second happy time, and things like that. Did you find in your work, research and writing that the German time scale, how the Germans view it, do they have the kind of same high marks and low marks as the Allies writing about it have, or are they on kind of different journeys? Because in looking at the book, you do absolutely lay out the optimism at the beginning and this sense that they are looking back at the First World War, going off to be this incredibly effective arm in the Germans military, and then the gradual realization that they're not going to come out of it alive, and all the tech that comes in to get them, and the depth charges and the coastal command and ASDIC and all that kind of stuff. The timelines, how because otherwise, do you do it chronologically, month by month by month?
Yeah.
But to go back to my question, do the Germans have the same marks in their calendar as the Allies have?
Essentially, yes, because those high points are fairly obvious to all concerned. So, you'd have significant sinkings, like the Athenia at the beginning, the Laconia in September 42, for example. These sort of stand out. Even the Royal Oak in October 39, and then of course the big operations, Operation Drumbeat, the expansion of the war to the American East Coast, which is January 42, and then that's climactic spring of 1943. With Black May and the withdrawal of the U-boats, of the Wolfpacks rather, from the Battle of the Atlantic. So the sort of the key points of it are pretty universal of the narrative. But what I tried to do with this, and in a way, I was a little bit, I suppose, trying to get away from this whiff of the sort of regimental history, the division history sort of stuff that we talk about, because there's some good books on the Battle of the Atlantic, but they tend to be either quite nerdy, if I may say, or they're very, very thorough. So you think of something like Clay Blair's Hitler's,
which has come up about half a dozen times in the sidebar already.
Right. So that is very worthy. It's very long, like it's 2 volumes, and each volume is about 1,300 pages. It's insane. Very thorough. And I sort of wanted to get away from just doing that again, because with something like this, what you say, it's the longest campaign, if you can break it into call it a single campaign of World War II. What I wanted to do was to do it in a slightly sort of episodic way. So I actually broke down, which I haven't really done before, I broke it down into really short chapters. So the book is chronological, but it's 60 relatively short chapters. So some of them are 2-3 pages, some of them a bit longer. So that allows you, in a sense, it means that you don't have to be completely comprehensive and list every sinking and every mission and every patrol, which is the trap that I think that people like Clay Blair fell into.
So it seems, So
you don't have to be comprehensive, so you can pick and choose and be a bit sort of pointillist about it, and pick the moments that you think tell a wider story, whether that's in terms of, technological developments or morale or whatever it might be. And then you're able, through doing that, you're able to not only get away from that a burden of trying to be over comprehensive, but it also allows you to paint a much bigger picture in terms of the broader context, what's going on the home front, to what extent is the propaganda at home kind of working, how do they do it, and all that sort of thing, which is all stuff that I wanted to try and bring in.
No, absolutely. And it leads me to what I was going to ask about the contextual aspect, because as you said, some of the books about the U-boats or the submarine war generally, it's the repetition of just how cramped it was, and lots of periods of boredom, and then moments of intense excitement, and then so on. And if you catalog them all, it just becomes sort of, as you say, repetitive. But the thing about, I guess, being in a submarine, be it a German one or an American or British one, is we talk about commanders on the ground battlefield having a limited understanding of what's going on around them. But when you're under the sea in a metal tube, you have even less ideas. So, without falling into the trap of just repeating, as I said, all that, it was cold, it was hot, it was sweaty, it was this. How did you try and tackle the idea of making it a contextual understanding? Because there are the perceptions about the Battle of the Atlantic that I think are interesting, in that people like Alan Allport and others have said, the Britain was never completely out of supplies. It was never quite at the crisis point that Parliament thought it was, etc., etc. So how do you balance that from going underwater to above water, essentially?
Yeah, and I think that structure, as I said, that's quite episodic structure allows you to do that, because you, in a sense, if you tried to write that all into one, like imagine it, or you've got sort of 6 years of warfare. If you broke it down into a year per chapter, then you've got maybe 12,000 words or something like that per chapter, maybe a bit more, 15,000 words per chapter. And then you've got lots of sort of clunky breaks where you've got to kind of go from, a U-boat on a mission to what's happening in Berlin or what's happening with Doenitz in Lorient or whatever it might be. And that proves that's quite difficult to pull off effectively. So actually the structure, did me a favor in that sense, because it allowed me to do those kind of, chop changes effectively. And a lot of the, so you mentioned Alan Allport and so on, those that have been revising this, I completely agree. And I think, and it comes across when you look at it from the German perspective as well, this fear that, Churchill's famous quote, which gets quoted all over the place, that this was the only sort of campaign that ever really frightened him and so on. I think that's been taken and run with, to some extent, out of context by, probably, 80 years of historians to some extent, and commentators. And you still see it coming up on, documentaries and all the rest of it. And it's been taken and it's been, expanded to look at, to apply to all of the U-boat war, all the way through, across 6 years. And really fundamentally, unrealistically, I think there was what he's talking about when he made that comment in his memoir. He's talking about the winter of 1940 to 41, which was a particularly difficult winter. That's when, to some extent, you can understand the concern, the level of imports that have come into Britain. In January 1941, for example, was precisely half what it had been in January 1940. So, from that moment, you can see a lot of British, bureaucrats and politicians and so on in Whitehall would have been going, well, if this carries on, we're going to be in trouble. And that's where he makes that. I mean, he makes it later, but he's referring to that period. That passes, as you know. So by the time you get to, certainly 43, but if not earlier, Allied countermeasures are, improving all the time. They're getting up to speed. The technology is coming on stream, so you've got Enigma is much more reliable at that point. The Atlantic Gap is closed in the spring of 1943, for example. So the Allied countermeasures are really improving, certainly over what they had been before. And the Germans are down to, maybe we could say, the second generation of commanders, because some of the best commanders, people like Prien and Kretschmer and so on, all removed from the scene in the spring of 1941 already. So you're already down to the next generation, who are by definition, less experienced, not as long in the tooth. I mean, someone like Prien had served in the German merchant marine before switching to the Kriegsmarine and then the U-boat arm, right? So he had probably 10 years of experience as a sailor in various guises before he even got, entered the war. So the next generation didn't have all of that. They didn't have that long background, that long, testament of ability. So, those commanders of the second and third generation are less well able to deal with what is a more effective foe, which is those advanced Allied countermeasures. So from then on, 43 onwards, it's effectively a duck shoot. They're really up against it. Hardly any of the U-boats from 43 onwards, hardly any U-boats that are launched from that period on actually score anything at all. Right, 16% of them sink nothing from 1943 onwards. Those launched from 1943 onwards, which is pretty astonishing.
Yeah, that's pretty telling.
Yeah, so that happy time, that time of the success that they had, is very much the early phase. Is 40, 41, 42, and then 43. It's like two heavyweights going toe to toe in the ring. And there's only going to be one winner in that, and it's going to be the Allies, primarily because the Allies are able to replace their losses much quicker than the Germans can, through Liberty ships, for example, the Americans are producing. So I completely agree. I think this, the degree of threat to Britain that this represented has been massively overblown. I get why, but after 80 years, it's about time we put that to bed.
Yeah. And, paraphrasing what you said, I mean, they are to some extent punching above their weight, the U-boat Wolfpacks in the early part of the war, but by the end it's actually the opposite, and so they are draining the German supplies and resources for much less reward. And again, that's, as I said at the beginning, that's kind of is the period I think people are ignoring. I mean, there's sort of like we talk about the wereaboos with regards to some aspects, but I think there's a U-boat-roos as well. There's people who have kind of fixated on the romanticism of because they look so cool. We did a show about some individual U-boat commanders a couple of years ago, and they kind of lend themselves to storytelling because it's the beards and the kind of the different types of uniform and the sort of disrespect for authority in some ways. There's almost like a piracy aspect to them. It makes them slightly romantic, but at the same time, you're a proper historian doing the proper work. You're getting rid of that romantic image.
Yeah, and where that comes from. Of course, it's people like Otto Kretschmer, of course, who survived the war. He was captured in 1941. He survived the war, and he did sort of, he did the rounds. He did World at War in the 1970s and all the rest of it. And he was always very cool, right? He was almost the epitome of kind of German cool. And then on top of that, you've got sort of Das Boot and Jürgen Prochnow as the Kaloin in Das Boot, who's unbelievably cool. I mean, Christ, even I'd sleep with him. He was just amazing. So, I mean, obviously in his 1981 form,
I haven't even watched it.
Not the elderly guy that he is now.
No, not doing that. No.
But yeah, so that's where I think to a large extent where the cool comes from. It's sort of and they were, some of them, I mean, not all of them obviously, but some of them were mavericks. They were that sort of guy. And Doenitz kind of sought that out to some extent. He wanted those people that had, they ticked all the boxes as experienced sailors and all the rest of it, and conforming and ticking giving him necessarily what he wanted. But some of them very obviously didn't really fit into the sort of the discipline structures and so on of the Kriegsmarine. Someone like Joachim Schepke is a good example. He's a bit too sort of hot-headed for that. So he was a brilliant U-boat commander, and somehow Doenitz could kind of see that. So there's some truth in that call. And then of course to add on to that, the way the U-boat arm, particularly his successful commanders, were sort of lauded to all heaven and garlanded with medals by the Third Reich, and sort of literally sent on lecture tours and all the rest of it. They became the celebrities of the regime. So, that adds to that element of cool as well, I think, in the perception.
Yeah, well, as Doenitz came up, we'll start dealing with some of the questions from the viewers because they're flying in. And Doenitz, I think he's sort of escaped over the years the kind of analysis people like, I don't know, again, people on the surface get, the Montgomerys, the Pattons, the Bradleys and things. But we have a comment from Scott Grimwood, which I'm interested in your reaction to. He says, I think Doenitz micromanagement led to the destruction of the U-boats and fleet. He literally loved them to death. What's your remarks to that?
That's an interesting one. He certainly loved his U-boats, and he loved his U-boat crews, his U-boat boys. You know, he was the second part of the question. He loved them to death. I can kind of see that, but I think that also, what Scott's question kind of misses or misconstrues is that Doenitz did have the vision, strategic vision, that had he been given his head earlier on, and had he been given, the necessary numbers of U-boats that he was always requesting, which he wanted this 300 U-boat fleet, which he only gets in late 1942, for example, by which time it's too late. But had he been given his head earlier on and given what he wanted, that could potentially have changed the game. We could be, talking about a genuine threat to Allied supply lines that would, whereas now we're saying that there really wasn't. For example, the Allied merchant fleet never really dipped to anything like sort of critical levels. Between the beginning of the war and the end of the war, it more than doubled in terms of tonnage. Right? That's not an Allied fleet that's under strain at all. So had Doenitz been given the resources and everything else that he wanted, and he did have the strategic vision that nobody else shared, right, until it was too late. So I think, yes, to a degree, he certainly, he saw his U-boat fleet and his U-boat boys as potentially a war-winning weapon. And he's constantly pushing them on, and that's perhaps where the micromanagement comes from. Yeah, he's constantly trying to push them forward and make them better and make them technologically better as well. So he's been accused of being a bit sort of backward with the technology, but really he isn't either that at all. But I think it's because of that the fact that he has that strategic vision. He's just frustrated in getting it actually to get any traction with the higher ups. That's the problem. Yeah. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than Scott's question gives us.
Also, Scott added the next part. He's referring to the requirement for U-boats to report their position by radio regularly, which is
yeah, that's certainly true, and that very often that very often could betray their position and all the rest of it. So yeah, that fair point there, Scott. Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, you've just sort of said this, but Gary said, does Roger believe the Germans were guilty of not building enough Type 9 long-range boats during the time when they could have the upper hand? Is it fair to say they should have pushed it more at that time, and they left it too late, as you just said, to do that? I mean, he didn't get the resources.
Yeah, I would say both Type 9s and Type 7s. I mean, Type 7 is a perfectly good, Atlantic weapon. It doesn't have to be a Type 9. So yeah, I would say that. And the main distraction, I mean, this wouldn't have even had to have come at the cost of, Panther tanks or whatever it was. The main distraction financially and in terms of resources was the German surface fleet, which, as we know, cost a huge amount, was a great bauble that Hitler loved having this. He saw it as a representation of Germany's sort of restored might and all that sort of thing. It was going to take on the Royal Navy. And the surface fleet cost a huge amount of money, achieved precisely nothing in strategic terms in World War II. And as an example, for the cost, in inverted commas, the cost in terms of resources and everything else of producing Bismarck, the battleship Bismarck, you could have produced 40 Type 7 submarines, which would, at the outbreak of war, for example, would have more than doubled what Doenitz had in the field. So you can see how that just a realignment of those resources and manpower and all the rest of it, from the surface fleet that did nothing to the potential of the U-boats could potentially have changed the game. So I can certainly agree with the premise of that question. So yes, not just Type 9s, but Type 7s too.
Okay. So Ian asked, because you mentioned earlier about someone transferring, were significant members of the Kriegsmarine moved from surface ships to submarines?
Yes, they were, and even people from desk jobs in the Kriegsmarine. So in the second half of the war, after I said you've got that sort of second generation and third generation. By the time you get down to the fourth generation, some of the U-boats that are launched in the last year and a half of the war, they're being captained by people who are very often sort of 25, very, very young, people that weren't even in the Navy at the beginning of the war. So none of that long experience that people like Prien and Kretschmer had, and so on. And very often the officer class of those U-boats are being drawn from people that had desk jobs in Lorient, La Rochelle, or wherever it was. And in many cases, apart from fairly rudimentary training, have never even set foot on a U-boat. So you can tell how that would impact on the crew's ability to withstand the stresses and strains of a war that had very obviously turned against them by then. And then the knock-on effect on morale, even for the rest of the crew as well. So, all of the sort of training regimen and the rest of it just kind of almost went by the board by the end of the war. And it's quite shocking. And that contributes to those really catastrophic losses that the U-boat arm suffers in, 44, 45, for example. Like I said, shooting fish in a barrel to a large extent. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. There was mass transfers from, other branches of the Kriegsmarine to the submarine arm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We had a question from Rog saying, what was the furthest U-boats operating in combat roles? Because I think we all have this perception of the bitter weather of the North Sea or the Atlantic there. That's, there's already questions about U-boats in the Mediterranean. We've done things in the past about the coast of New Jersey and what have you. They do spread over a really wide area.
They do.
What kind of, what theaters does your book cover?
It covers them all, actually. I mean, the Atlantic is the most significant by some distance. So the Arctic, obviously, as well. We know the story of PQ-17 and all of that. So the Arctic is significant in its own way. Mediterranean is a bit of a distraction. Like Doenitz was quite annoyed by the diversion into the Mediterranean because it didn't serve his purpose. His strategic vision was knocking out Britain's supply lines and sort of being used in a attack sense against Royal Navy vessels in the Mediterranean. To him was a waste of time. That's not what U-boats were for. They were supposed to be commerce raiders. So that annoyed him. But in terms of answering the question, the furthest they got effectively is they had a U-boat base at Penang in Malaya, which most people are not aware of. It was only small, but they had one there, supply base under Japanese occupation, of course. So they would still raiding in the Indian Ocean. They were raiding at the end of the war. There's a couple of U-boats that are raiding the west coast of Australia, and we don't really generally consider that to be territory where the German reach got to. But it did. So that's the answer to the question. That's as far as they got, Malaya and the west coast of Australia.
And that I now feel that compelled to ask you, would there have been something the Germans could have done better by concentrating their force in one area? I mean, this moving them around multiple places, if they had tried and focused on one thing, if indeed Doenitz had been allowed to do that. I mean, we don't really like counterfactuals, and you probably don't like counterfactuals, but you must have had thoughts doing it of if this had changed a little bit this way and if this had been done that way, could things have been different?
Yeah, you see, the strategic vision here is, as I said, they're concentrating on the North Atlantic because that's where most of it's coming from. Most of the supplies are coming from. The war expands in 42 into the Caribbean as well. This Operation Drumbeat and all of that. That's the west coast, east coast of the US and so on. So that's the main effort up until 43, and then 43 they withdraw the Wolfpacks because of the mauling that they're getting at Allied hands. So there's still U-boats that operate individually in the North Atlantic, but they're not operating the Wolfpacks like they had done. And then you get this sort of spreading, which is already going on. As I said, the Arctic, even the Black Sea. There's even a flotilla on the Black Sea, which is a remarkable story in itself. Like how they got there is a technological marvel, frankly. So the operations in the Indian Ocean are kind of almost a compensation for what they're losing in the Atlantic, right? So they send them down into the Indian Ocean, in a sense, trying to stretch the British so that the British would have to transfer their forces and transfer escort forces into the Indian Ocean as well. So the idea is to try and, almost like a rugby game when you try and pull the defence in one direction so you can hit them somewhere else. It's a bit like that. They're trying to sort of stretch British resources or Allied resources into a theatre that they don't necessarily want to be in. The problem is with that, of course, that it stretched German resources as well.
Yeah.
And ultimately, British resources or Allied resources were that much greater than German resources. So I think, strategically, that was a misstep. But you can see the logic behind it, at least. And then, from that point on, it is just a war of attrition. And they are trying to, keep going in too many theatres, effectively, and spreading their effort far too thin. So, yeah, I think ultimately that is probably a mistake. And maybe they should have concentrated on, getting the technological shortcomings rectified in shorter order and getting back out into the Atlantic and taking on the convoys. But as I said, those countermeasures by 43 onwards are absolutely brutal and are absolutely ripping a swathe through them. So I can see why they looked for an alternative.
Okay, thank you. Technology, because one of the things about, again, I'm going to take it back to the ground before I go undersea again, is that if the Allies deploy, for example, a new tank destroyer or armored vehicle, they're not going to be able to keep it hidden for very long, because the chances of them being able to eliminate an entire enemy force, there'll always be that one German guy said they've got this tank with a so and so. But with submarine warfare, because U-boats tend to, when they go, they tend to be very, very fatal or captured. How were the Germans reacting to the increased technology that goes on? Ian Carr asked that at the beginning. Did the Germans have systems to become aware of the developing technologies developed for use against them, notably Hedgehog and the like? Because there were obviously lots of cases of just U-boats not returning without anybody really knowing what happened to it. So it could have been a new thing that knocked that U-boat out, but how would the Kriegsmarine know?
Yeah, that's the problem. It's very interesting we talked a bit earlier on about sort of sources and so on. One of the sources that I sort of enjoyed, if you like, most was the Allied interrogation reports that they did with from prisoners. And when they sort of forced a U-boat to surface and surrender, and they surviving crew taken prisoner, there's a lot of those reports. Each one is done by U-boat number, so whatever it would be, U-30, I can't remember the numbers, U-30 or U-126 or whatever it is, so it goes on, and they're all sort of separated out. And there's lots of them in like 1940, there's lots of them in 1941, 42, and then they tend to tail off. So there's a few in 43. In the first half of 44, there's a couple, and then there's kind of nothing, which I remember thinking was quite frustrating. And I'm thinking, well, what's happened? Where are they? Right. The point is they're not taking prisoners by the middle of 44, because their countermeasures are so effective. And this is your question there, Ian, I think it was, referenced Hedgehog. Hedgehog is tremendously effective. They reckon it statistically it's probably about 10 times more effective than depth charging at destroying U-boats, because it destroys on contact, right? It explodes on contact. So depth charge, barrel bomb, roll it off the back of the ship, the whole thing goes up. It's set to explode at depth, set depth. If that's close to your U-boat, you'll sustain damage. You might sort of spring a leak or two, and if the damage is bad enough, you should be able to surface and surrender yourself. Or if you're particularly bold or stupid, you can try and fight it out on the surface. But that's why in the early phase of the war, there's all these surrenders, right? Because they're being depth charged, they're being damaged, but they can still surface and they can surrender themselves, right? That's the sort of the pattern. And then by 43 onwards, the most usual form of attack is either by the air, from radar equipped aircraft, but Coastal Command and others, which is hugely effective. They can spot a U-boat by radar, using radar from about potentially 15 miles away, zero in on it. By the time the U-boat spots them, they've probably got about a minute to dive and get out of the way. Otherwise, they're going to be, have all hell unleashed upon them. Much more effective at sinking U-boats, not just damaging them and forcing them to the surface, but actually sinking them. And then you've got Hedgehog as well, which, as I said, is a contact mortar. So you fire 48 of these things in one barrage out not the back of the vessel, but the front of the destroyer. And they only explode when they hit something. So if they hit your U-boat, that's right on the pressure hull of your U-boat. There's no way you're coming back from that. You're going straight down. So the increased use of aerial, radar-equipped air attack, and then of Hedgehog means that vast numbers from late 43, early 44 onwards are just going straight down, right? So to go back to the question, the question of how the Germans kind of react to these technological advances is a difficult one to answer, because most of the people that might have realized there was something going on are long since dead, right? They went straight to the bottom of the Atlantic and elsewhere by definition. There is an interesting story around this, which I include in the book, which is about radar. So the Germans had radar detectors, an early model called the METOX, METOX, which detected the Allied radar set ASV Mark II, if you want to be nerdy about it. And that worked on a particular wavelength, and the METOX picked it up. So as soon as you got zeroed by an aircraft carrying an ASV Mark II, the METOX would ping. So okay, we've been zeroed. Let's get down, and you've got a few minutes, and you can get away, right? No problem. But when the British developed the ASV Mark III, had a different wavelength, METOX didn't work. So those vessels equipped with METOX then were being attacked out of a blue sky by Allied aircraft with the METOX not going ping at them, and they go, what the hell, the METOX is broken. Then the rumor spreads, because in the sort of chaos of that, I mean, you can imagine the stress of that situation. The rumor spreads fairly quickly that not only is the METOX broken, but the METOX is actually giving away their position, right? Which is not true, because it can't. But that's in the stress of the situation. That's the narrative that they develop. So then you get German commanders who actually switch the thing off and say, well, I'm not going to bloody use that because it's betraying my position. So you can see, armed with a fraction of the information, plus, the stresses and strains of combat and the rest of it, some of these guys are making completely the wrong decision in response, and very often paying for it with their lives. So, that's one little example that comes back to Ian's question, how the Germans react. Where they react at all, or where we can actually see how they react, sometimes they react in a very bad way.
You said stresses and strains there, and I think the blurbs on your book make a big point about the fact it is the voices of those who were there, and I'm interested to know what they were seeing were the problems, because again, from the Das boat idea, it's the kind of the cramped condition, it's a sweat, it's the spring in the leak, it's the danger of being sunk by a depth charge. But there's also, someone asked earlier about what are the German logistical problems. In fact, that was Gary asked that. Can Roger explain the logistical supply problems for U-boats? But is that the kind of thing that people who are in the boats are noticing, or is that more the kind of thing that's being noticed at a sort of a mid-management level back on shore? I mean, what are the day-to-day gripes of someone on submarine? Because I would think it would be the immediate environment of the metal tube, the smelly, oily metal tube they're in. But are they aware of a more sort of a broader contextual understanding of the war, and either the weapons the Allies are bringing to bear on them, or the inefficiencies of their own system?
Okay. There's quite a lot in that, Paul.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so it's a nice open-ended question.
It is, yeah. So I mean, there's two points there. The first one about what they griped about. I think two things that come out very strongly. The filth and stuff. I mean, everyone has that. It's a universal thing. Yeah. Right from the early days when they're very successful, the so-called happy time. They're still filthy, and that is kind of a given. And some of the submariners even a little bit revel in it. They kind of wear their salt streaked tunics almost as a badge of honor, kind of thing. So that although there are individual accounts that they complain about it, saying how revolting it was and the smell and stuff, and trying to sort of scrub it off your skin when you go back to base and things like that. There are a few of those, but I think it's because it's so universal. It's almost like background noise. But so two things that they do complain about: supply, which goes back to the question. The supply network was really quite difficult, because they go out essentially for an 8-week patrol, right? That's the kind of the average time. If you fired all your torpedoes off and you couldn't get resupplied, then obviously you go back earlier. But that was the sort of standard pattern. And they had fresh food for 2 weeks, so fresh produce for 2 weeks, and then they had everything else was tinned. So once after that 2 weeks and they've got rid of eaten all the fresh produce, then they're down to all the tin stuff. And it was pretty generous because the high command appreciated very clearly how significant food supply was, and quality of food and quantity of food was for maintenance of morale. They understood that with absolute clarity. So they are quite well supplied, but still, they run out. And just if you've got a U-boat that's in a pretty rich vein of form, and it's right out and it's engaging convoys in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, whatever it might be, you'd want to keep it out there. You don't necessarily want to bring it back to France just to sort of pump it full of fuel again and more torpedoes and the rest of it. So they did have this supply network of these supply U-boats, known as the Type 14, is known as a milk cow, which is slightly bigger, slightly fatter, and it's essentially unarmed. It has a deck gun, but it's essentially unarmed, has no torpedoes. And they just used to fill it with fuel and fill it with torpedoes to be given to other vessels and food. And it had a bakery on board, for example. They had a doctor on board, and it just kind of went round, and it would arrange these sort of rendezvous with the attack U-boats, and they would supply it with all the necessaries for them to stay out for another 2 weeks. So that worked very well. The Germans only had 10 of these Type 14s, which the British very quickly realized what they were, and started targeting them using Enigma decrypts, and were very effective at targeting. The last one was sunk in the summer of 1944. So they realized that if they can hit the supply network, they can render the attack U-boats effectively lame, which they did. So that was a real success for Enigma. And they've got these surface vessels as well that sort of go under a false flag and so on and do the same job. There's a couple of those that are quite notable. So the supply situation, that was that. So the supply situation is generally pretty good, but a lot of the men kind of complain about the monotony of the food, about when they're running low and they have to essentially the cook, bless him, who's got to cook three square meals for 50 men every single day in a galley that's about the size of a wardrobe. Bless him, he's got a couple of cans of peas and some semolina. What are you going to do? He's going to put it all together in one bowl and give it to the men. So things like that would kind of upset you as a submariner. So they complain about the food. The other thing they would complain about was, or that comes up as a problem anyway, it's not necessarily that they complained about it, is combat stress. And that looms quite large in the book. So there was an account that I found of naval doctors in, I think it was Lorient, who were trying to sort of study combat stress during the war. And they knew that the higher ups were not interested because it didn't fit with the Nazi image of Marshal Dash. And the men themselves didn't tend to report it because for the same reason. They saw it as, evidence of cowardice or whatever it was, low moral fiber, whatever. But there are a few cases that they managed to get hold of and speak to people. And they realized that this is the tip of a fairly large iceberg. And then when I read that, I went back to some of the personal accounts and the diary accounts and so on, and started rereading those. And then you see little episodes that suddenly, okay, that could well be combat stress. Nervous breakdowns, catatonia, for example. There's a couple of people struck catatonic. During depth charge attacks and things like that. The most obvious one was the suicide of a commander. Peter Zech pulled out his pistol and shot himself in the head during a depth charge attack in 1943, I think it was. So everything from insomnia, panic attacks, all the way up to suicide, and with everything in between. So that, to me, I think that's something I don't think has really been talked about before in this context properly. But it's a reasonable assumption to make that it's basically, it's pretty much ubiquitous, and most of those crewmen would be suffering from it in some form. And it's quite noticeable when you look at the 1 in 4 that survived. A lot of those, I know this from anecdotally, a lot of them were profoundly damaged by their experiences. And I had this comes back to a story from my wife's family. So my wife's great uncle was on a U-boat, survived the war, and when I heard the story of it, I was already working on the book, and I heard it from my mother-in-law, who said, I knew someone who was on a U-boat. And I sort of fell off my chair, and asked for more information. She said when she was growing up, this guy used to come to the house, and she said he used to come to the house in the middle of the night in his pajamas, and then we'd have to call the police. And I said, well, what was going on? She said, well, he was so broken by the experience of the U-boat war that he spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions. So, and I thought, okay, that tells a story in itself. I know it's anecdotal and it's one case, but I think you can probably, quite safely assume that wasn't an isolated example.
There's enough data to extrapolate that fairly accurately, I would think.
I would say so. Yeah. So that would be another thing. So that, the PTSD, what we now call PTSD, combat stress, that element, I think is much more widespread. I don't think we've really talked about it in the U-boat context at all, actually, but I think it's very widespread, and that comes across in a lot of the personal accounts as well.
And Trevor Sheehan reminded us today is World Mental Health Day. So, which brings me to, we discussed it before going live. I mean, you've written about people who are victims of the Axis in World War II, notably about Poland. And, we can all have empathy for people who are so frazzled by their job, they commit suicide, etc., etc. Did you feel any empathy or sympathy for the U-boat crews, or was your history objectivity hat firmly on the fact, no, these are the bad guys? How did you analyze that? How did that work out for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my sort of guiding principle, I suppose, is that I like to try and contribute something to the narrative. So I don't want to just, kind of retread, a story like, with all due respect to those that are fascinated by the dam busters, but I don't want to go and,
I knew you were going to say that.
Read. I probably complained about the dam busters before. I don't want to retread the dam buster story for this year's generation kind of thing. Great though it is, I don't think there's much new that we can possibly say about that particular subject. So I'm always looking for gaps, essentially, where I can actually try and contribute something. So it's not necessarily about wanting to look at, the victims versus the perpetrators. Yeah. It's more about looking for the gaps. And then so like Berlin at War, for example, was about, the people of Berlin and their experience of warfare, whether it be rationing or bombing or, the evacuation or whatever it is. So, their interaction with the regime and how that changed. So, you can make the same case there. Should we be talking about them? Well, I would say we should, because, we owe it to ourselves as historians to try and understand the story we're looking at in the round. And you don't understand that by just looking at one side. You sometimes have to look at the other side as well and see how they viewed things. And that doesn't imply sympathy, or hopefully not. I think when you do that, and I had the same thing with Berlin, if you don't, when you're writing it, and you mentioned the word objectivity, or sort of historian's objectivity, absolutely right. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. In a sense, the analogy I always have in my head is that you're sort of, you're the eagle kind of floating above the battlefield sort of thing, and you're sort of seeing everything very objectively. But at the same time, you need to, you do need to dive down and look at the human stuff, because that's what keeps people reading. That's what brings it alive. That's what sets it apart from, some of that sort of regimental history stuff that I was sort of mentioning earlier on, which tends to be very, very thorough. The rivet counting and all the rest of it tends to be very, very thorough, but honestly, not a brilliant read. So you do need to do the human stuff, and that means, to some extent, encouraging a degree of, I would say, at least human empathy. I wouldn't say sympathy, because I think that's a bit too strong, but at least an empathy. When I was reading about these 22-year-old boys, or 24-year-old commander on his maiden patrol, going out, being tracked throughout by Enigma, and then by hunter killer groups, for example, by the Allies. Is like 44, and that the guy hasn't got a chance. Like, he's just going to get destroyed at the first instance, and they are, and they think, if that doesn't at least bring a flicker of human empathy to you, and especially when you've got kids of that age. I mean, my son's 25, and you can't really not kind of almost project those of your loved ones into that sort of situation. And I just thought there is something deeply tragic about it, and it shouldn't translate to an assumption of sympathy for the regime or for all of that. That would be ridiculous. But I think on a human level, I think it's a fair thing to do, I think.
But I was out in the Falaise Gap a couple of days ago, and I quote a guy from the first Adolf Hitler Liebstandarte SS, Jupp Steinbuckle, about the ferocity of the attack he's under. I use those. I say I don't have sympathy for him, but I do have empathy in that I understand the situation. But it also allows me to explain to my group the effectiveness of the Allies in bringing to bear on him something so destructive that he is writing about it in that way. And I think this brings it back to where we were saying at the beginning, this perception that the U-boat war was bringing the Allies to its knees. Well, actually, the story is it was the Allies bringing the U-boat fleet to its knees halfway through the war. Hence why you get these harrowing accounts of those who, the comparatively few who survived, 25% survived. So I think you don't have to have sympathy, but it does highlight the efficiency of the countermeasures. And on that subject, we've got a couple more sort of technical questions for you. So two about weather. So Pedro asked earlier on, what impact did the U-boats have on weather reporting and prediction? Because the Japanese use their submarines for all sorts of things, including transporting fuel and people. We think of it purely as this aggressive going out and sinking stuff. But are they doing other things like weather reporting?
That's interesting. Honestly, Pedro, it's not something I particularly thought about, but they are reporting back. So, I mean, actually, the radio traffic tends to be minimized by the later phase of the war. They tend to almost be running silent because they're concerned about the radio being intercepted and so on, and those signals being, enabling the Allies to zero in on them. Whether that is, entirely plausible and possible or not, didn't matter, but they perceived it was the case, and they tended to run generally as silently as they could. So there was no sort of wanton, reporting back all the time, referencing an earlier question. But they are recording, certainly. So the war diaries are recording weather conditions. They're recording sea conditions, and certainly earlier in the war, some of that would have been reported back as well, I would imagine. But very honestly, it's not something particularly that I looked at, I'm afraid.
Okay, so, no problem.
Maybe for another volume.
For another volume. But the next question, I think, we can broaden it out a bit, and it's about, would the Wolfpacks have benefited from better weather data themselves? So more stations there. But I think we can open that out. Was it the failure to incorporate the U-boat Wolfpacks into some sort of wider combined arms aspect, where it is, as we just said, the Allies are using air, surface vessels, undersea vessels, ultra, it's all combined, and technology. It's all combining to destroy the U-boat fleet. But we're back again to this idea of these individual commanders going out on an individual patrol, or maybe being a large part of a larger Wolfpack. But really, it's sort of, we don't think of it as being an integrated system.
No,
so should the Germans have got a better integration?
Yeah, they probably should have done. I mean, there was a Condor unit based at Bordeaux, which was Kampfgeschwader 200. So there was a degree of collaboration with them, particularly in the Bay of Biscay, but they just didn't have the reach much beyond that. And then there's always the sort of these sort of internecine squabbles and so on in the Third Reich, which are very, very common, particularly in Third Reich. I always describe it as, you imagine rats fighting in a sack. That's the upper echelons of the Third Reich. Right there. So, Doenitz is not going to get much collaboration out of Goering with the Air Force. He does a bit with KG 200, but nowhere enough. And they just don't have the capacity. Like I said before about the sort of the waste of money that was the German surface fleet. It achieves precisely nothing. Had that been bigger, and something that genuinely could have rivaled the the Royal Navy and the Allied navies and the Canadians and others and the Americans, then yeah, maybe you could have had a different scenario altogether in the Battle of the Atlantic, but it just didn't. So the U-boat crews that are going out are very much on their own. I mean, they might find themselves as part of a Wolfpack of 5 or 6. Chances are they probably wouldn't even see the other members of the Wolfpack. Even if they collaborated with them in an attack or two, they probably wouldn't even see them, and they're very much on their own. So in that sense, this comes back to the point we're making about the sort of the grand strategic vision and all of that. And we still, inflate the threat of the U-boat.
Yeah.
For all the reasons we said, and you're absolutely right, Woody, when you say, what's combating them, what destroys them, is essentially combined arms operations. You've got the surface fleet, you've got control of the air, you've got Enigma with all of that intelligence, you've got logistical background, you've got the Americans producing Liberty ships hand over fist. You can't defeat that as a solitary U-boat. You just can't do it. So absolutely. So they are on their own, and I mean they might have benefited from more combined ops mindset, but they just didn't have the wherewithal to do it.
So as we begin to bring things to an end, I mean, you said about wanting to always bring something new to your subjects, which you always do, and that's why we love you so much. But was there anything you went into this project where your previous thinking, because you're like me, you would have grown up with the war movies, The Enemy Below, and all that kind of stuff. So was there anything you started with that your thinking was turned 180 degrees on? You go, I really was wrong on that.
Yeah, it was Atrocities, actually.
Right.
As you know, my previous books, written about Poland, for example, where there are, just looking at 1939, there are massacres of Polish POWs and civilians sort of hand over fist in 1939 and beyond. I mean, it's unbelievably brutal. So I was, I suppose, kind of assuming that there'd be not necessarily something similar, but at least more of that sort of thing in evidence, machine gunning survivors and that sort of thing. Yeah. And that very much was this kind of, that's the stereotype that we tend to have if we have one at all. And two things in response that did surprise me. I mean, there's only one documented war crime carried out by U-boat troops, U-boatmen, which is the sinking of the Peleus in spring 1944. Where they machine gunned. I mean, it's a minor distinction, but they machine gunned the debris because they wanted to get rid of the debris. They wanted it to sink, so that it wouldn't just betray their position. And of course, hanging on to the debris were the survivors of the Peleus, right? So only 3 men actually survived the night. It's a pretty brutal exercise. I mean, they weren't necessarily aiming for the men, supposedly, but the end result was, all were killed except for 3 men. Those 4 guys that carried that out, including the commander, Heinz Wilhelm Eck, were arraigned by the British as war criminals and subsequently executed. 3 of them were executed. 1 was acquitted in Hamburg at the end of 1945. Before anyone raises a hand in protest, it's very possible that there were other similar examples. Yeah. But they're lost to history, right? So perhaps they killed all the survivors. Perhaps that U-boat crew was then killed late, the next day. All hands lost, and the event is lost to history. That is possible, I guarantee. I grant you, but it's nonetheless interesting that there is only one documented war crime carried out by German forces of the U-boat arm. Particularly when you think about, almost in every other theatre, it's a sort of a litany of atrocities and massacres and so on. And you have to ask yourself why that is, which I do in the book, and I hope I make a decent fist of it. So that's one aspect, and then the other aspect related to it is that I think was genuinely surprising, more so than that bit actually, was the extent to which the U-boat crews tried, certainly at the beginning of the war, to essentially stick to the rules of submarine warfare, which meant that you had to, stop the vessel, verify that it was a legitimate target, allow the crew off the vessel if you decided to sink it, allow them off the vessel, and then you were then responsible for that crew, right? So there's a couple of extreme examples of, there's one of a U-boat crew where they actually towed the lifeboats of this merchantman to the Irish coast, and so ferried them to the coast. So they're fulfilling these requirements of the interwar regulations on submarine warfare to the letter. And that surprised the hell out of me. And there's many more, lesser examples, but certainly examples of crews, providing blankets or, water or medical care, whatever it might be. At the very least, saying to them, here's some blankets and land is that way, So far from that stereotype, and, certainly the wartime stereotype that we imagine perhaps that these shipwreck crews are going to be machine gunned. It's actually what's more common is the opposite, which again I found surprising. And if you look at the Laconia order, which is issued in September of 1942, that is where the High Command basically forbids German crews from extending assistance to the crews that they've just sunk. Right. It's halfway through the war. It's the end of 1942, and they're being told to stop doing it. That, I think, says everything. It's weird, but it says everything about that point I just made. That this was it wasn't every time, absolutely not, because very often the circumstances didn't allow it. But it was common enough that they were told at the end of 42 to stop doing it. That, I think, is really interesting.
A couple more questions and we'll bring things down. These are going to be quick ones for you. So Trevor is saying, and your favorite submarine film, and why is it Das Boot?
Yeah, well, it is going to be Das Boot, isn't it? I mean, Das Boot is fantastic. I said I'm old enough to remember it from the first time around, and it's one of those that always sort of stuck in my mind. I didn't watch it, actually. I didn't watch it or read the book again until I'd finished writing this book, because I didn't want it to sort of influence the way I saw the material. I did include, there's a small section where I include, the mission, for example, or the patrol that Lothar Gunther Buchheim went on, which is what the story of Das Boot is based on. So I did include that, but I didn't rewatch the film until after I'd finished it, after I finished the book. And when I did, and I sat, sort of treated myself and sat down and watched it, and I sort of loved it all over again. It's an astonishing piece of cinema. Jürgen Prochnow is incredible, and it shows a lot of the things that that came out very strongly from the research and in the book. Not least the the mental strain that the men are under, the sense of camaraderie, which is something that we alluded to, but maybe just before we came on, Woody. But that sort of camaraderie that crews would actually be almost curated by their commanders, so that you had a good fit of people and characters and so on, because there's nowhere to hide on a U-boat, right? Such a small, enclosed, claustrophobic, environment, that you couldn't have someone who was a pain in the arse or just didn't get on with people or cause trouble. You had to get the guy off and get someone else in. So they almost were able to curate their own crews, and that meant real sense of camaraderie, because everyone was dependent on everyone else for their survival. And they used to have these sort of evenings where they get the squeeze box out and have a couple of beers, and which again we don't. It's in Das Boot, for example, but we thought, well, that can't have been how it was, but it is. It's in the account. So when I rewatched it, it's sort of there was a lot of moments where I kind of was going, oh yeah, I wrote about that. Oh yeah, there was that. There was that bit. So yeah, I think it's a fabulous film.
Yeah, no, and World War II Analyze just said, maybe because they're out on these long patrols and what have you, they're not being exposed to perhaps the propaganda some of the other branches are getting. So maybe that leaves reasons why there's a bit more of a trace of humanity there, because of the isolation, and that they're not just being exposed to the same kind of stuff that particularly that those are going on regular leaves and things from the the Eastern Front. You're being exposed to all the Lebensraum and everything is normalized, and that they're a little bit kept safe from it in some ways, so that they can be a bit more human.
I think there's two factors here. There's opportunity and there's ideology, right? So, and in both cases, I think there's a sort of a lack in the U-boat arm, and I'll briefly explain why. So, in terms of ideology, it seems that there there's a rival tradition in the U-boat army, as there is in the Kriegsmarine generally, which is that of, you know, what I call the solidarity of the sea, which is, you know, that the old thing about, you know, all against the sea kind of thing. You know, yes, of course we'll sink your boat, but you know, the convention is you generally don't machine gun the survivors in the water, and that still persists really, you know, into World War II. Exactly that comment, brotherhood of the sea, exactly that. So that does persist, and it's kind of surprisingly persistent, if you like, and to some extent, you know, it rivals with or even overrides the sort of the more brutal ideological demands of the Nazi regime. And then the other aspect is of course that, you know, Doenitz kind of kept that a little bit at the door. Now, he was a convinced Nazi without question, but he kept that indoctrination element a little bit at the door, not because he was oppositional, but because he basically had the attitude that, you know, we're all on side, you know, all of my boys and me, we're all good Germans, and, you know, good, we support the regime, we support Hitler, we don't need that stuff. He saw it as superfluous, right? So he didn't allow ride-alongs, you know, none of those propaganda officers or the indoctrination officers, political officers, if you like, were allowed to ride along with the U-boat patrols. So, you know, that didn't happen. So in sense, the indoctrination was a little bit kept at the door. And then the other aspect is opportunity. So if you're an infantryman on the Eastern Front, and you know, the ideology is there, it's told you these people are subhuman, and they're right in front of you, you know, it's quite an easy jump to make to you know, join in the atrocity you've been ordered to make. But U-boatmen barely even see, not even the vessel that they're trying to sink, never mind the crew come out of it. So the opportunity to actually act any of that out, even assuming that those impulses are there, are fewer and further between. So I think there's various factors there that play into this, but the end result is that, you know, you generally don't see it. You know, it's a very I say in the book, I think it's the cleanest theatre of World War II, which is kind of significant.
Yeah, it is. So Trevor Sheehan is sort of echoing what you said about, or what we both said about the lack of a combined arms. He's the Operation Torch and Tunisia expert, is that they just don't have a system. They never go out there with a sense of combining ground, air, and sea, and so therefore it's all sort of pulling in different directions, and a lack of understanding of modern warfare. I mean, the Allies struggle to get there, but at least they're aiming for it. At least they are trying to solve that riddle of making everything work for each other. Whereas so often it seems the Germans don't seem to try and solve that. It's all, let's get a new bigger bit of tech in that doesn't work. But one last question for you, because it is about the Wolfpack, but it is about the war against the Wolfpack. So Gwilym asked earlier on, which was the most effective anti-U-boat aeroplane, Sunderland, B-24, Beaufighter, Hudson, or another one, or is it a combination of all of them?
Oh wow, that's tough. I mean, that's by way of, you know, a rather sort of lame wriggle out of that particular question. I mean, I'm looking at this from the German perspective. So
well, what were they more afraid of?
It didn't matter, right? Because they were all going to attack you. I think, you know, the key point of this. This is, I know it's not answering your question, Gwilym, and I apologize, but the key point is to understand that, you know, more U-boats are lost to aerial attack, particularly radar-equipped aerial attack, than any other medium, right? Which again, it sort of goes against the stereotype, because we all think about depth charging. You know, that's the way it was done. That was the most primitive, the most, you know, the bluntest weapon in the armory. Effectively, once you've got Hedgehog, once you've got, you know, aerial radar-equipped air attack, you know, those are much more effective. So if I can wriggle out of that one and say, you know, from a German perspective, it didn't bloody well matter.
Didn't matter. Well, I mean, even from the Allied point,
aircraft it was.
The aircraft is the tool, isn't it? Behind that is Ultra. Behind that is SIG. Generally, behind that is the information, the weather. But it's, you know, it's what we're reaffirming what we said earlier. It's not the aircraft is just the actual scalpel at the end of the surgeon's arm, but there's a whole process. There's an ER department behind it, if I continue that medical analogy there. So, final thought then, Roger, is you know, who's the book aimed at? Is it aimed at the kind of the Kriegsmarine U-boat fan, or is it more broadly aimed at someone who likes a contextual understanding of World War II and I was going to say diving undersea, literally diving undersea?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that question, whenever I'm asked it, you know, who's this aimed at? I would say absolutely everybody on the planet is my first answer.
That's the best way. Yeah.
You know, it's not written necessarily for, for the nerdy, those specialists in the subject. I mean, they probably know a lot of it already. I would say it's much more for everyone to, get a decent handle on the subject, an overview. It's relatively pithy. As I said, it's kind of quite episodic. So it gives you a good overview from, on the German perspective. It gives you a new aspect because of that German perspective hasn't really been there before. So the short answer is everybody. I hope some of the specialists will pick it up and appreciate it as well. But yeah, that's anyone and everyone, Woody. That's what I'd say.
Brilliant. Well, a few people already said it's either on their Christmas list or they're buying it straight away. So that's good. A few more royalties in the post to you. So Roger, as always, it's delightful talking to you. I wish we'd caught up at We Have Ways, but I wasn't there this year. Hopefully I'll be there. I'm going to a conference in London in May, so maybe I'll see you around there. But in the meantime, good luck with the book. Not that you need my extra endorsement, but good luck with it. And thank you for sharing the stories you have with us today.
My great pleasure, Woody. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you. So, folks, I'm back in for a rare Saturday show tomorrow looking at the death of Sikorsky in a B-24. So that's a show for tomorrow. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guests' books, read their blogs, etc., etc. See you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.